My name is Nora Kessler, and I was 25 the evening my parents took me to dinner to inform me that I was adopted. My mother was smiling when she explained that they had only kept me for the money attached to me, and that the money had run out, so I had run out with it. My father pushed a stack of paperwork across the tablecloth toward my plate. They had already gone ahead and filed to erase me from everything they owned. I didn't cry. I didn't make a sound for nearly a full minute. But here is the one thing neither of them had accounted for. 6 months earlier, I had found my birth family, and that night, I had quietly seated them 3 tables behind my mother's chair. She simply hadn't turned around yet. What happened when she finally did is the reason I'm sitting here 6 years later, telling you any of it at all. Welcome back to Quiet Justice Stories, where we tell calm, true-to-life family stories about boundaries, dignity, and the moment a person finally stops shrinking to fit a chair they were never actually offered. If you have ever had to earn your place at your own family's table, this story is for you. Leave a comment below and be sure to subscribe. The restaurant was called Solène, and I had never once been brought there in my entire life. My mother chose it, and that alone should have been my first warning, because Vivian Kessler did not spend money on me unless the reason was printed somewhere on a receipt. She wore the gray cashmere she kept in reserve for funerals and board meetings. My father, Gerald, had reserved the table under her name rather than mine, which I only realized when the hostess asked, and he answered before I could open my mouth. There was no banner, no balloon knotted to the back of my chair, no cake hiding in some back kitchen with my name written across it in blue icing. For a birthday dinner, the table sat oddly empty, and the air between my parents carried the careful courtesy of 2 people about to read out a verdict. I had spent 4 years of my life sitting in rooms exactly like this one. I arranged tables like this for clients, for signings, for the hushed conversations families have when someone has died and the money has to be moved. I knew the difference between a dinner and a deposition, and this had the exact temperature of a deposition. So I did what I always do when a room turns cold. I studied my breathing, and I counted the exits. That was the moment I noticed the small brass number standing on the table behind us and to the left. Table 9. I held it in my mind without fully understanding why, the way you memorize a landmark before you have decided you'll need to find your way back to it. I set my own small thing down beside my water glass, a thin manila folder, plain and entirely unremarkable. My mother glanced at it and assumed, I think, that it was a resume or perhaps a greeting card. She had no idea what I had placed inside it. To understand why I wasn't surprised that night, you have to understand what birthdays were in our house. When I was little, my birthday was 1 candle. Not 1 candle as some fond family tradition, the way certain families do a single tall number. 1 candle jabbed into a grocery store cupcake my mother picked up on the drive home and never once thought to refrigerate. I would watch it sweat on the counter while she took a phone call. Meanwhile, 3 weeks later, my cousin Trent got a rented bounce house and a caterer carrying tiny quiches on silver trays because Trent belonged to my Aunt Marlene, and because Trent was blood. I still remember asking, the year I turned 8, whether I could have a party too. My aunt was over, drinking my mother's wine, and she answered for her. "We can only do 1 nice thing a month, honey," she said, and she said it gently. That was the part that taught me the most, how warm people can sound while they explain your size to you. So I learned the arithmetic. 1 cupcake costs less than a party. A child who asks for less is cheaper than a child who asks for the same. By the time I was 9, I had stopped asking for a cake at all, because I could see that it made the math simpler for everyone at the table, and being simple felt like the only currency I actually had. I didn't tell myself it was sad. I told myself it was efficient. That's the trouble with growing up useful. You never notice you've been priced until somebody reads the number out loud. And across that white tablecloth at Selene, 25 years old, I could feel my mother preparing to read it. I walked out of that house the week I turned 18 with 2 duffel bags and a community college acceptance I had filled out myself. Nobody drove me. I worked nights behind a pharmacy counter and took classes in the morning, then transferred to the state school and finished a paralegal program while waiting tables on the weekends. I paid for every bit of it. I want to be clear about that, not because it makes me remarkable, but because it matters for what happened later. Nobody handed me a single thing. By 25, I was a paralegal at a trusts and estates firm downtown, and I was good at it. I spent my days inside the wealth of other people, organizing what becomes of a person's life once they can no longer hold on to it. I drafted the tedious pages that decide everything: beneficiary designations, distribution schedules, the quiet language that determines who eats and who doesn't, long after the funeral flowers have wilted. I could read a trust the way some people read a face, and the great joke of my life, the one I didn't laugh at for years, was this: I could set a flawless boundary for a total stranger. I could tell a grieving widow precisely what she was owed and precisely what she wasn't. But I could not, to save my own life, ask my family to want me. The only person I ever telephoned was my grandmother. Every Sunday, 4 o'clock, steady as a clock, all through college and after. Nana Edith. She was the one Kessler who answered the phone as if she'd been waiting for it to ring. And it was something Nana once said to me that turned out to be the hinge the entire night would swing on. Nana Edith Kessler was my father's mother, and she was the only adult in that family who ever made me feel like a person instead of a line on a ledger. She had opinions about everything and apologies for nothing. When I was 12 and crying in her kitchen because Trent had told me I wasn't a real Kessler, she set down her dish towel, took my chin in her hand, and said the sentence I carried for the next 13 years. You were chosen, sweetheart, not collected. Then she made me a grilled cheese and let me stay up far too late. Nana died when I was 23, 2 years before that dinner. I gave the only eulogy that spoke of her by who she had been rather than what she had left behind. And within a month of the funeral, my parents quietly moved out of their cramped split level and into the larger house on Crestview Road, the one that had belonged to the family for a very long time, the one tied to Nana's name in ways I understood better than they realized. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was grieving. But there was something Nana said to me on one of our last Sundays, her voice thin over the line, that I filed away without truly understanding. I made sure, she told me, that you'll never have to ask anyone for your own life. I assumed she meant it as encouragement, a grandmother telling a granddaughter to stand tall. It would be 6 months before that dinner, while sifting through county records for an entirely unrelated reason, that I discovered she had meant it literally, in writing, and notarized. The year before I turned 25, my family began to go quiet around me, and not the comfortable kind of quiet. Texts that once came back within an hour now took 3 days. My mother stopped folding me into the holiday planning chain, then acted astonished when I arrived at Thanksgiving without a side dish nobody had asked me to bring. My Aunt Marlene, meanwhile, got louder. She had started using a word in the family group chat she'd never bothered with before. Blood. As in, this is a blood-only weekend at the lake. As in, the cabin sleeps 8, and we'd like to keep it to blood this year. You understand? I understood perfectly. I simply didn't yet have the documents that would tell me why the temperature had dropped so suddenly, all at once, in the same single season. People don't usually turn cold on a schedule. Families drift, sure, but this was not drift. This was coordinated. And the analyst in my brain kept flagging it, the way you notice 3 unrelated invoices arriving on the same Tuesday and realize they are not unrelated at all. So when my phone lit up one evening in March with my mother's name and a voice 3 degrees warmer than it had been in a year, I didn't feel flattered. I felt the small, cold click of a lock turning somewhere I couldn't see. "Honey," she said, and she only ever called me honey when she wanted something. "We'd love to take you out to celebrate 25 properly, the way we never quite managed to." And every instinct I had built over 4 years of reading other people's bad news told me the same thing at once. This is too neat. Here is what most people misunderstand about my mother. They assume the cruelty is loud. It isn't. The cruelty is the planning. The cruelty is a woman who never once managed a birthday cake, suddenly reserving a corner table at Solène and calling it celebrating you properly. When Vivian turns generous, it is because a spreadsheet somewhere has assured her the generosity will pay for itself. I had watched it my whole life. I had simply never been the line item before. So I said yes, sweetly, the way she had trained me to. And then I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long while, doing the thing I do. I thought about timelines. I thought about the house on Crestview Road. I thought about the word blood surfacing in the group chat at exactly this moment, exactly this season. And about a sentence my grandmother had said to me before she died. And I thought about the manila folder already sitting in my work bag. The one I had assembled 6 months earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with my mother and everything to do with finally knowing where I came from. I didn't call my parents back to ask questions. I didn't warn them that I'd been to the county clerk. Instead, I made a few calls of my own. Quiet ones. The kind you make once you've decided you are not going to be ambushed. You are going to be ready. I won't tell you yet who I called, but I'll tell you the rule I live by, the one Nana never said aloud yet taught me all the same. When my mother is sweet, someone at the table is about to lose something. This time, I just made sure it wouldn't be me. People assume a story like this is about money, and I understand why. There's a will somewhere, a house, a folder sliding across a table. But sitting in my car in the Solène parking lot that night, engine off, hands steady on the wheel, the thing I was afraid to lose carried no dollar figure at all. I was afraid of losing the last idea I still had that I had ever belonged anywhere. Because as cold as that house had always been, as transactional as every candle and every casserole, it was still the only origin story I owned. And they were still, technically, my parents. And if they cut that thread tonight, the way I suspected they'd come to cut it, then I would be exactly what Trent had called me at 12. Not a real Kessler. Just a girl somebody had picked up and put down. That was the wound they were aiming for, and they knew it, because it was the wound they had been pressing on my whole life. What they hadn't accounted for was that the wound had already closed. 6 months can do that, if the right people find you. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror, tucked the folder under my arm, and crossed that lot with the particular calm of a woman who has already read the last page of a book everyone else believes is still being written. I wasn't walking into a disownment. I was walking into a goodbye I had already chosen. They just didn't know it yet. We ordered drinks before anyone said a single true thing. My mother praised the wine list. My father retold a story about parking he had already told in the car. And then, somewhere between the bread and the entrees nobody would end up eating, Vivian folded her hands and slipped into the voice. I know that voice. It's the one she used when she returned a Christmas gift right in front of me and explained why it hadn't been practical. We've always done our very best for you, she began. Gerald nodded along half a second behind her, the way he'd nodded behind her for 30 years. We gave you a roof, an education, more than a great many children ever get. I let her talk. I laid one hand flat on the manila folder beside my plate and watched my father's eyes flick down to it and away. The folder had a label on the tab, typed, just the top edge showing above my fingers. He could make out 4 letters of it if he looked. And he looked. So I covered the rest with my thumb, not to hide it, just to let him wonder. And I watched the wondering begin to work on him. My mother kept going about sacrifices, about how a child ought to understand the cost of being raised, and I thought about a sweating cupcake and 1 candle, and I said nothing. Then she paused, took a small sip, set her glass down with the precision of a woman arriving at a slide she'd rehearsed, and delivered the line that opened the door to everything. There's something, Nora, that you should have been told a very long time ago. She said it the way you'd announce a change to a dinner reservation. You're adopted. We adopted you when you were an infant. You were never biologically ours. I want you to know we never intended to keep it from you forever. She watched my face as she said it, and I understood she was waiting for the collapse. This was the moment she had built the whole evening around, the corner table, the cashmere, the rehearsed pauses, all of it engineered to land right here, on the second her adopted daughter learned she'd been a stranger all along, and shattered into pieces her mother could sweep up and walk away from. I would love to tell you it didn't land. It landed. Some part of a person always braces for the floor to be beneath them, and mine had just been told there was no floor. But I'd had 6 months to learn this already, and the only thing my mother actually revealed that night was how little she knew about me. She leaned in, almost gently, and delivered the sentence I will hear in waiting rooms and quiet kitchens for the rest of my life. We only kept you for the benefits. She smiled as she said it. That was the detail that ultimately set me free. Not the cruelty. I'd been raised on the cruelty. The smile. A woman does not smile delivering the worst news of your life unless she has rehearsed it enough times to enjoy the choreography. And in that smile, I finally saw the entire shape of it. I hadn't been a daughter who disappointed them. I had been an asset that had finished depreciating. Benefits is a clean word for a dirty arrangement, and my father, to his discredit, tried to explain it like an accountant defending a tax position. There were assistance payments in the early years, Gerald said, not meeting my eyes. The adoption came with a small monthly subsidy when you were little, but that ran out a long time ago, when you were still in grade school. There were tax considerations after that. And there was your grandmother, of course. He didn't say her name kindly. He said Nana had held certain expectations about family, that adopting me had helped them meet those expectations, and that meeting them had turned out to be, in his careful accountant's phrase, worthwhile for a good many years. I sat very still and let the arithmetic of my childhood rearrange itself into its true equation. The single cupcake, the hand-me-downs from Trent that still carried the tags from Marlene's returns, the way the heat got turned down in my room first. They had not been poor. They had been pocketing the difference between what a child costs and what a child generates, and I had been the generator. We invested in you, Gerald said, as though that settled it, as though a child were a rental property with a depreciation curve. And then my mother, impatient with his bookkeeping, cut straight to the line underneath all the others, the one the whole evening had been assembled to deliver. The subsidy has been gone since you were a child, Nora, and whatever came after it ends today. You're 25 now. There is simply nothing further that keeping you around does for us. She said it almost regretfully, the way you'd note that a coupon had expired. Now you're not useful. 2 sentences, and they had reduced a quarter-century of being their daughter to a line that had stopped producing income. I reached for my water. My hand did not shake. I noticed that it didn't, and I filed it away as a small, surprising gift. Then my father did the thing he had come to do. He reached into the leather portfolio he'd brought, the one I had assumed held a birthday card, and slid a thin sheaf of papers across the tablecloth until it touched my plate. "We've already filed," he said, "to formalize things. You won't be in the will. You won't be a beneficiary on anything of ours. We wanted to handle this cleanly, in person, so there'd be no confusion later." He'd rehearsed cleanly. I could hear the lawyer who had coached him in it. And here is the part I have never been able to make my family understand. The part that turned the entire night for me without my saying a single word. I read the caption on the first page in about 4 seconds, the way I'd read 1,000 of them, and I saw at once what they had done. They had filed against the wrong instrument. They had spent good money cutting me out of an estate that was almost beside the point, while leaving entirely untouched the document that actually decided everything. They didn't know what I knew. They believed the power in this room ran through their own modest will, and so that was where they'd aimed their expensive little knife. I didn't correct them. You don't tell the other side they've sued the wrong defendant. You let them finish. So I slid the papers an inch back toward the center of the table, neither accepting nor refusing, and I let them go on believing they had won. Across the table, my Aunt Marlene's voice arrived on speakerphone from inside my mother's purse, because of course Marlene was listening, because Marlene had been the architect of half of this. "Blood looks after blood, Nora," she said, warm as a knife in soup. "You've always understood that." I didn't cry. I want to be honest that part of me had expected to, that some 12-year-old still living in my chest had been braced for this exact table since the night Trent told her she wasn't real. But 25-year-old me simply took a slow sip of water and set the glass down without a sound. And I watched something cross my mother's face I had honestly never seen there before. Disappointment. Not at me, at the performance. She had written this scene with a sobbing girl in the lead, and the girl was not sobbing, and it was spoiling her ending. "Aren't you going to say anything?" she asked, and there was an edge in it now, the brittleness of a woman whose script has jumped the rails. I considered the question. I considered everything I could have said, the whole flood of it, 25 years backed up behind one small dam. And then she made the mistake people like her always make. She filled the silence by reaching for the line that had worked the first time, expecting it to work again. "We only kept you for the benefits," she repeated, slower this time, leaning on each word, trying to draw the blood she could see. But a sentence loses its teeth the second time you hear it from the same mouth. The first time, it had been a revelation. The second time, it was just a confession, and not about me. It told me everything about her and nothing about my worth. I set my napkin in my lap, smoothed it once, and let her watch me not break. And behind her, at table 9, a woman with my exact chin turned her head toward our table and went still. To explain what was inside my folder, I have to take you back 6 months, to the week 2 envelopes arrived and rewrote the arithmetic of my entire life. The first one I had been waiting for. After Nana died, I had finally registered with the State Adoption Reunion Registry, half certain nothing would ever come of it. 8 weeks later, a letter arrived in handwriting I didn't recognize, careful and looping, the hand of a woman who had practiced what she wanted to say. It was from Laura Bennett. She wrote that she had been 19 when she gave me up, that she had not wanted to, that she had thought of me every March for 25 years, and that if I ever wished to meet her, she would drive any distance on any day with no expectations. She'd signed it, and then, beneath her name, she had written one more line, the one I read so many times the paper eventually went soft. I never stopped saving you a seat. The second envelope came 3 days later, and it had nothing to do with Laura. Or so I thought. Our state had only recently opened original birth records to adult adoptees, available once you turned 21 and filed through the same reunion registry, and I had put in my request the week Laura's letter arrived. While I was in the county system waiting on mine, I pulled the file on Nana's estate. Professional habit, the way a dentist studies strangers' teeth. And there it was, in the distribution schedule of the Edith Kessler Family Trust, executed 2 years before her death, administered not by my parents, but by a bank. The caregiver distributions to Gerald and Vivian Kessler, it read, shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter Nora. Not their estate, hers. Held by a trustee they couldn't touch, scheduled to leave their hands forever on the exact date they had selected for that dinner. 2 envelopes in a single week. One told me where I had come from. The other told me, in my grandmother's notarized hand, exactly what my parents were about to lose and precisely why they were suddenly in such a hurry. I did not phone my mother and scream the discovery down the line. That is not the weapon I had, and it is not the weapon I trust. I've watched too many families lose everything to a satisfying outburst that a lawyer later turns into evidence. What I had was process, so I used process. I took a personal day and drove the trust documents to an estate's attorney with no connection to my family and paid her out of my own savings to confirm what I already suspected. The caregiver distributions were legitimate, ongoing, and ending. My parents had been drawing a monthly sum for raising me and living in the house the trust funded for the better part of 2 decades. The remainder, on my 25th birthday, passed to me by the trust's own terms through a corporate trustee with nothing my parents could file, sign, or shred to stop it. Their will was irrelevant to it. Their disownment was theater, performed on the wrong stage. My attorney asked whether I wanted to notify them, get ahead of it, soften the landing. I said no. I said I wanted 3 things in a folder, and that was all. The retainer letter, so they'd know I had counsel. The trust's distribution schedule, so they'd see the date in black and white. And my original birth certificate, with Laura Bennett's name in the mother's line, so that when the moment came, the table would understand exactly which family I was choosing to leave, and which one I was choosing to keep. I labeled the tab, closed the folder, put it in my bag, and carried it for 6 months like a quiet engine I hadn't yet switched on. The dinner invitation only told me when to turn the key. I met Laura Bennett for the first time in a diner halfway between our 2 cities, because she didn't want me to have to drive too far, and that small consideration undid me more than any speech could have. She was nervous. She'd brought a photo album that she kept opening and closing without showing me, as if she wasn't certain she'd earned the right. She had my chin and my habit of going quiet when I felt too much. Over 6 months, we built something carefully, the way you'd repair a bridge while standing on it. I learned I had a half-brother named Owen, 20, all elbows and questions, who was texting me memes within a week of our meeting as if I'd always been there to receive them. I learned my birth grandmother was a small, ferocious woman named Opal, who took one look at me and said, "Well, there she is," as if I'd merely been late, not gone for a quarter century. They never once asked me for anything. That was the part my whole nervous system couldn't parse. No favors, no money, no role to perform. Laura told me, the third time we met, the thing that would become the truest line of my life. "We've kept a seat for you, sweetheart," she said. "We never gave it to anyone else." And I, who could draft a flawless beneficiary clause for a stranger, who knew the precise legal language of belonging, sat in a vinyl booth and had no idea what to do with my own hands, because I had been wanted for the first time by people who got nothing at all out of wanting me. After 25 years of being useful, I had no idea how to simply be welcome. I was about to have to learn fast. There is a difference between being needed and being wanted, and I had only ever known one of them. Being needed, I understood completely. Being needed is a job. You show up, you produce, you stay easy. You keep the math simple, and in exchange, you get to keep your seat one more quarter. I had been needed my whole life, and I had mistaken the steadiness of it for love, the way you can mistake a long commute for a destination just because you make it every single day. What Laura and Owen and Opal offered me had no job attached to it, and that frightened me more than my mother ever had. The first time Laura called just to ask how my week had gone, with no agenda underneath it, I spent the entire conversation waiting for the catch. And when there was no catch, I had to pull my car over because I couldn't see the road. I kept testing them in small, ungenerous ways I'm not proud of. I'd cancel a plan to see whether they'd punish me. They didn't. They'd just say, "No worries, next time," and mean it. I'd offer to pay for everything, to make myself useful, to earn the seat. Opal finally took my face in both her hands, the way Nana used to, and said, "You don't have to buy your way in here. We already paid." And slowly, across those 6 months, a knot I'd carried since I was 9 began not to vanish, but to loosen. I started to believe, against 25 years of evidence, that a person could simply want me in the room. So when my mother called to invite me to celebrate 25 properly, I already knew where I wanted to spend the evening. I just decided to spend it everywhere at once. Here is who I called. The night my mother booked Selene, I called Laura, and I asked her a question I'd been too afraid to ask anyone in my life. "Would you come to my birthday dinner?" I explained the whole shape of it, the parents, the suspicions, the trust, the speech I could feel coming. I told her I didn't know exactly what they planned to say, but I knew I didn't want to hear it alone, and I knew I no longer wanted to perform the grief they were counting on. Laura didn't hesitate for even a second. She said, "What time and where? And should we dress up?" Then she said something that made me put my hand over my mouth in my own kitchen. "We'd be honored," she said, "to watch you not need them." So I made one more call, this one to Selene, and I booked a second table for that same evening under my own name, Nora Kessler, Party of 3. "Table 9, the host told me. "Near the back, 3 tables behind the reservation already on the books for a Kessler Party of 3 at the front." I almost laughed at the geometry of it. They had no idea they'd be staging my disownment within sight of the family that had spent 25 years saving me a chair. I told Laura and Opal and Owen to arrive a little after us, to order quietly, to simply be there, and to let me come to them when I was ready. I won't pretend I didn't want them in that room. I did. There's a reason the truth lands harder spoken in front of people than mailed in a letter, and I'd watched enough confrontations to know that a private one only ever becomes the other side's word against yours. So yes, I wanted witnesses, and I am not ashamed of it. But Laura and Opal and Owen were never merely witnesses to me, and that was the whole difference between what they were doing and what my mother was doing. The folder was how I'd make my parents understand they had lost. Table 9 was where I'd go to remember that I had won long before they ever sat down. Back at the front table, in the present, my mother decided the silence had run on long enough and moved to close the deal. She produced one more page from the leather portfolio, turned it to face me, uncapped a pen, and laid it across the paper like a small gift. "It's just an acknowledgement," she said, "that we've informed you, that you understand the situation. Sign it, and we can all enjoy a civilized dinner and go our separate ways." I looked at the page and I didn't have to read far. The release paragraph opened with the exact boilerplate I had typed 100 times myself. "The undersigned hereby waives and forever releases any claim, interest, or expectancy." And the rest of it did what that language always does. It wasn't an acknowledgement. It was a waiver-wearing one. A tidy little document designed to have me agree, on the record, that I'd been notified and had no claim. The kind of thing a careful lawyer drafts to head off exactly the challenge I was in a position to bring. They wanted my signature while I was still bleeding from the reveal, before the shock wore off and I could think clearly. It's a classic move. I've watched grieving people sign away fortunes at kitchen tables because someone slid the pen over at the right wounded moment. My mother was counting on my wound. She didn't know it had a trust attached to it. I left the pen where it lay. My father, across from me, kept glancing at my manila folder, and I watched the worry climb his neck in a slow red tide. Gerald had always been the one who knew where the money actually lived. He'd seen the 4 letters on the tab. He was doing the arithmetic now, the same arithmetic I had done 6 months earlier, and I could tell the answer was beginning to frighten him. "Is there," he started, then stopped. "Is there something we should know, Nora?" I smiled at him, the first genuine smile of the night. "Not yet," I said. That was when my Aunt Marlene arrived in person, with Trent trailing behind her, both of them feigning the surprise of people who'd been waiting in the bar for a text. "Nora, what a coincidence," Marlene said, pressing a cold cheek to mine, and I understood instantly that Vivian had summoned reinforcements. My mother liked an audience for her best work, and she especially liked one that would nod along and apply pressure if I turned difficult. Marlene pulled up a chair without being asked. Trent, 26 and still dressing as though his mother bought his clothes, gave me the look I'd been getting since we were children. The one that said, "You were always going to end up at the kids' table eventually." Marlene got right to it, because subtlety was never her instrument. "We just want what's best for the family," she said, laying a manicured hand over my mother's. "And families have to make hard choices about who's really a part of them. You've always been such a practical girl, Nora. You understand that blood looks after blood." There it was again, that word, the one she'd been seeding in the group chat all year, finally spoken aloud at the table it had been built for. I looked at my aunt, who had answered for my mother the day I turned 8 and explained to a child why she wasn't worth a party, and I felt the last thread of obligation in me go slack. These were not people I was losing. These were people I was setting down. I had carried them a long way, far longer than they deserved, and my arms were finally, gloriously tired. Across the table, my father wasn't joining in. He was staring at his hands. And then, while Marlene was mid-sentence about the family's wishes, Gerald leaned toward me and said something low, just for me. "Your grandmother loved you," my father said, very quietly, under Marlene's chatter. Then he stopped there. For a moment, I saw the whole other version of Gerald Kessler, the one who might have existed if he'd ever once chosen a harder thing over a comfortable one. His eyes were wet. He had loved his mother. That much I knew was true. And some part of him understood that the woman he'd loved had built a wall around me with her own money precisely because she didn't trust her son to protect me. That had to be a terrible thing to sit with at a dinner table. I waited. I genuinely waited, because there was a version of that night in which my father said the next sentence, the apology, the, "I'm sorry, this is wrong, I won't do this." And I would have heard it, and it would have mattered. But he looked at my mother, who was watching him the way a handler watches a dog that has wandered toward the road, and I saw him choose. He sat back. He picked up his water, and the almost sentence died in his throat, where so many of his almost sentences had died over the years. That was the closest thing to love anyone at the front table offered me all night, and it lasted 4 words and a swallow. I didn't hate him for it. You can't hate a man for being exactly the weight you always knew he was. But I understood, finally, that the reason they'd filed in such a hurry, the reason for the whole rushed, cruel evening, was sitting there, behind his wet eyes. He knew about Nana's trust. He'd known the date was coming, and he had hoped, desperately, to get my signature on a waiver before I ever discovered what his mother had done for me. So I asked him a question, not loudly, not as a daughter. I asked it in the voice I use at the firm when I've found the flaw in someone's filing and I'm giving them the dignity of noticing it themselves. "Dad," I said, "which instrument did you file under? Your estate or Nana's trust?" The table went quiet in a new way. My mother's wine glass paused on its way to her mouth. Marlene's manicured hand stopped patting. Gerald blinked at me as if I'd begun speaking a language he half recognized from a country he had never visited. Because in 8 words, I had told them 3 things they had not budgeted for. That I knew there was a difference between the two, that I knew which one mattered, and that I had known long enough to learn the vocabulary cold. My mother had never heard me use that voice before. None of them had. To them, I had always been the quiet one, the easy one, the girl who took the smaller slice so the table could stay pleasant. They had built the entire evening on the assumption that I would receive my fate, not audit it. "What?" my mother said, and it came out smaller than she meant it to. "What are you talking about?" I let the question sit. I've learned that the most powerful thing in any room is the person who doesn't need to rush to the answer. I turned my water glass a quarter turn on the cloth, lined it up with the edge of the manila folder, and looked at my father, who had gone very pale, who already knew, and who was silently begging me with his eyes not to open it. Then I opened it. I didn't make a show of it. There was no flourish, no slammed document, no speech. I simply turned the folder so it faced them and laid the 3 pages out on the white cloth, side by side, the way I would lay exhibits before a client who needed to understand their own situation. The retainer letter first, with the firm's letterhead and the unmistakable line confirming I was represented by counsel. The distribution schedule of the Edith Kessler Family Trust second, with the relevant paragraph already there in black and white for anyone at the table to read. And third, my original birth certificate, with Laura Bennett's name where my mother had always assumed her own name belonged. I didn't point at anything. I let the paper do the work paper does. My mother's eyes went to the trust schedule first, because of course they did, because some animal part of her had always known where the money slept. I watched her read it. I watched the words go in. The caregiver distributions to Gerald and Vivian Kessler shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter, Nora. I watched her reach the word remainder and the word Nora, and I watched the color leave her face from the top down like a window shade being drawn. She looked up at me, then at Gerald, then back at the page, the way people do when they're hoping the second reading will say something kinder than the first. It didn't. It never does. "Mom," I said gently, because I could afford to be gentle now. "You filed against the wrong family. The one you cut me out of was always the smaller one." My mother is a quick woman, and I'll grant her that. Even now, it took her about 10 seconds to assemble the full picture, and I watched her do it in real time. The house on Crestview Road, funded by the trust she'd assumed she'd live in forever. The monthly distributions that had quietly furnished her comfortable life and that ended by their own terms tonight. The remainder, the real money, the part she had spent 2 decades adjacent to and never controlling, passing on this exact date to the daughter she'd just told she was finished with. And the waiver, her clever little waiver that I had been seconds from signing, that would have been worth precisely nothing, because it released a claim on an estate that was never where the value lived. She had aimed every weapon she owned at a will and missed the trust entirely. The cruelty had been free. The mistake had been expensive. And here is where I learned the last thing my mother had to teach me, which is that people like her never apologize at the moment they're caught. They pivot. Her face rearranged itself, the cold draining out and a terrible warmth flooding in, and she reached across the table for my hand. "Nora," she said, and her voice had gone soft and wet and maternal in a way it had never once been when it cost her anything. "We're still your parents. Whatever's in those papers, that doesn't change what we are. We're family." The word family, from the mouth that 20 minutes earlier had said, "We only kept you for the benefits." I looked at her hand, reaching for mine, and I did not take it. The same sentence that had been her weapon was now, in this light, the confession that cleared me to leave. People expect this is the part where I made them pay, where I detailed exactly what the remainder was worth, watched them squirm, perhaps ordered the most expensive thing on the menu and left them the bill. I understand the appetite for it. I've felt it. But I want to tell you the truth about power, because I handle it for a living. The strongest position in any room is not the one holding the biggest number. It is the one that doesn't need the number at all. I had a career I'd built with my own hands. I had savings I'd earned waiting tables and drafting documents. I did not need Nana's remainder to be free. And that, more than any dollar figure, was what my mother could not survive understanding. So I closed the folder. I gathered the 3 pages back into it, unhurried, and I kept the pen they had brought for my surrender and set it neatly beside her plate. I had won the thing they thought we were fighting over before any of them sat down, and I had won it by knowing, by preparing, by refusing to be ambushed. There was nothing left to argue. There was only the choice of where to spend the rest of my birthday. And I had made that choice 6 months earlier, in a vinyl diner booth, when a nervous woman with my chin slid a photo album across a table and didn't ask me for a single thing. I administer estates for a living, and I'll tell you what I tell every client being circled by people who only appear when there's something to gain. if someone in your life shows up only when you're useful, you already know exactly what that is, and no amount of shared history makes it love. Type the word boundaries below if you've had to learn that the hard way. And subscribe, because the part you came for is about to happen. I stood up. I did it the way you'd rise from any table, no drama, just a woman pushing her chair back and reaching for her folder. But the effect on the front table was immediate. My mother's hand was still hanging in the air where mine should have been. "Sit down," she said, and the soft maternal mask slipped, and the old cold control snapped back into her voice like a bone setting. "Sit down, Nora. Where on earth do you think you're going?" Marlene straightened. Trent, for once, stopped smirking. My father just looked tired, the look of a man watching the only good thing his mother ever did walk out of his reach forever. I picked up the folder and held it against my chest, and I looked at my mother, who had spent 25 years and one expensive dinner trying to make me understand that I had no real place anywhere. And I told her where I was going in the plainest words I owned. "My birth family is sitting 3 tables behind you." I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't need to. The sentence had been true for the entire meal. True while she smiled and rehearsed and slid her waiver across the cloth. True the whole time. She believed she was performing my disownment for an audience of strangers. She hadn't been performing it for strangers. She had been performing it within arm's reach of the people who'd been saving me a chair since long before she ever decided I'd stopped being useful. And I watched my words travel across the table and land. And I watched my mother begin, very slowly, to turn around in her seat. My mother turned around slowly, the way you turn when some part of you already knows and is begging the rest of you to be wrong. The cashmere shoulders rotated, her chin came around, and there at table 9, 3 tables back, beneath the warm, low light, were Laura and Opal and Owen, who had been there the entire time, who had ordered quietly and eaten almost nothing, who had watched my mother deliver the worst sentences of my life, and had kept their seats and their composure because I had asked them to let me come to them. Laura met my mother's eyes first. She didn't glare, she didn't gloat. She simply looked at the woman who had raised her daughter on 1 candle and a calculator. And then she looked at me, and her whole face opened like a window in spring. Opal, small and ferocious, had her napkin already folded beside her plate, ready. Owen had stopped pretending to look at his phone. My mother's gaze went from Laura's chin to mine and back again, doing the resemblance math. And I saw the exact moment she understood that the family she'd just told me I didn't have was sitting 15 feet behind her in real chairs at a real table, having watched her do the one thing she could never take back, in front of witnesses she hadn't known she had. She turned back to me, and her mouth opened, and nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had no script. And in the silence where her next cruel line should have been, a chair scraped back at table 9. They stood up, all 3 of them. Not to make a scene, not to confront anyone, just to be on their feet as I crossed the room to them, the way you stand for someone arriving at a gate after a long flight. Opal first, because Opal does everything first, and then Laura, and then Owen, knocking his knee on the table leg in his hurry. They didn't say a word to my parents. They didn't have to. Their standing said the entire thing. The restaurant had gone quiet around us, the particular hush of strangers who can feel something true is happening and have stopped pretending not to watch. A waiter froze with a tray, and I walked past my mother, who was still turned half around in her chair, past Marlene, whose mouth had finally run out of the word blood, past my father, who lifted his eyes to me as I passed and then dropped them again, choosing comfort one last time. 15 feet, 3 tables, 25 years. When I reached them, Opal took my face in both her hands, the way Nana used to, and Laura pulled out the empty chair beside her own, the 4th chair, the one they'd asked the host to set even though their reservation was for 3, and she said the words she had written under her name in that first letter, the words that had gone soft from my reading them. "We saved you a seat," she said. "We always did." And I sat down in the seat that had been waiting my whole life, at the table that had wanted me before they knew whether I'd ever come. That was when my mother lost the one thing she'd never lost in front of people: her composure. I heard her chair scrape, heard her stand, heard the front table calm she'd worn all evening crack straight down the middle. "After everything we paid for," she said, and it wasn't quiet anymore. It carried across the dining room, sharp and rising. "After everything we did for you, the schools, the roof, the years, you do this to us in public. You humiliate your family over money." Heads turned now, openly. A man at the bar set down his drink. Marlene was tugging at my mother's sleeve, hissing, "Vivian, sit down, people are looking." But my mother was past the reach of her own handler for the first time in her life, because the script was gone, and all she had left was the truth coming out sideways. "We gave you everything," she said, to a room full of strangers. And I noticed she said gave, not loved. Even now, even cornered, the word love would not come, because it had never been in the inventory. I stayed in my seat at table 9. I didn't stand to match her. I didn't raise my voice to meet hers. Laura's hand had found mine under the table, and I simply held it and let my mother be loud, because the loudness was doing my work for me. Every person in that restaurant was watching a calm young woman seated quietly with people who clearly adored her, and a furious older woman shouting about everything she'd paid for. And there is not a human being alive who hears a parent screaming about money and thinks, "Ah, there's the real family." My father never stood at all. He just put his face in his hands. I let her run out of words the way a storm runs out of rain, and when the quiet came back, I did one last thing before I gave the rest of my attention to my actual family. I stood, walked the 3 tables back to the front, and set a single page down on the white cloth in front of her. The trust's distribution schedule. I left it face up. I didn't need it anymore. My attorney had the originals, and I wanted my mother to have something to read on the longest evening of her life. "You can keep this one," I said. "You'll want to understand what ended today and what didn't." She stared at the page. Gerald reached for it and then didn't. And I looked at the two of them, my mother who had priced me at 1 candle, and my father who had loved his own mother too much to honor what she'd asked of him. And I said the only sentence I'd prepared in advance, the one I'd written in my head in the parking lot and decided I'd use only if I earned it. "You kept me for the benefits," I said. "They kept a seat for me." Then I turned around and walked back to table 9, and I did not look behind me again. Not once. Not when Marlene called my name. Not when my mother said something I couldn't hear and didn't want to. I sat back down beside Laura. Opal had ordered me a slice of the chocolate cake while I was gone, and Owen had stuck the little restaurant candle in it. A single candle, lit. And for 1 second, the symmetry of it caught in my throat. Then Laura leaned over and said, "Blow it out, sweetheart. Make the wish." And I realized I didn't have one. I already had it. The trust did exactly what my grandmother had built it to do. On my 25th birthday, the The caregiver distributions to Gerald and Vivian Kessler ended. On the date and by the terms Nana had notarized 2 years before she died. The remainder passed to me through the bank trustee, untouched by the will my parents had spent good money revising, because you cannot disinherit someone from a trust you don't control. Their waiver, unsigned, was worth what it had always been worth. Within a year, my parents sold the house on Crestview Road because without the distributions, they could no longer carry it, and moved into something smaller. And I'm told Marlene was furious to learn that none of Nana's money would be flowing toward Trent after all. The story of that dinner traveled the way these stories do, through the family and then past it. And the version in which Vivian Kessler is the devoted mother wronged by an ungrateful adopted daughter never quite took, because too many strangers at Selene had watched a woman scream about everything she'd paid for, while a quiet girl held hands with the family across the room. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't post anything. I simply stopped answering, and I let the silence be the boundary, which is the only kind that ever holds. My father texted me once, a few weeks later. 3 words. I am sorry. No name signed, no follow-up. When I didn't reply, I never replied. I heard later that when Marlene tried to rally the family to contest Nana's trust, it was Gerald who quietly shut it down, told them their mother had every right to leave her money wherever she pleased, that it was hers, that it was finished. He was right. He was also, as ever, a year too late, and saying it to the wrong room, when it cost him nothing and changed nothing. That was the whole of my father in the end. A man who knew the right thing, even felt it, and could only ever bring himself to do it once doing it had stopped requiring anything of him. I didn't need the apology, but I was glad, in a small, clean way, that he'd finally been right out loud. As for the rest of it, I spent that first real birthday eating chocolate cake at table 9 with people who got nothing out of wanting me, and I have spent every birthday since with them. Laura and I talk every Sunday now, 4 o'clock, the hour I used to save for Nana. Opal taught me to make her grilled cheese. Owen still sends memes. And somewhere in a drawer in my new family's kitchen, there is a photo album that doesn't close anymore because it finally has enough pages. Being useful was all my parents ever wanted from me, and being wanted was the one thing I'd never had. It took me 25 years and 1 terrible dinner to learn that anyone who only keeps you for the benefits has already told you, in the plainest language there is, that they were never your family at all. That's my story. 1 candle for 24 years, and on the 25th, a whole table that lit them all without being asked. If someone in your life values you only when you're useful, take this as your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. You do not have to earn the people who love you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.